Good evening, everybody. My name's Kim Dorman. I'm in the library right now, the actual library, so that's why I'm wearing a mask, but nobody else is. I just wanted to welcome you all. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to take a few minutes of sort of housekeeping notes to orient you all to Crowdcast before we get started. You'll see that there is a chat function that many of you have been using. Welcome. Yes, you are in the right place, Miss Oliveira. And once we start the program, I'm going to disable the chat, but we'll start it up again when we're starting for the Q&A. During the program, if you have questions, you can use the Ask a Question function, which is just there. And then if there are questions that you agree, and you definitely want that answered, you can upvote that question, and we'll be sure to talk with Ms. Shirley Satterfield or a member of the Historical Society to see if we can get the answers afterwards. If you have any troubles, you can always email me, K Dorman, so that's K for Kim, DORMAN at princetonlibrary.org, and I will see if I can help you during the program. In the meantime, it is my great pleasure to introduce Stephanie Schwartz of the Princeton Historical Society, or Historical Society of Princeton. They're a wonderful partner of ours. If you want to know all the things, all the reasons why we like them so much at the Princeton Public Library, you can see a recent blog post we wrote about that on the library's website. Ms. Schwartz will be introducing tonight's program, and Shirley Satterfield.
All right, thanks, Kim. Excited to be here. For those of you who don't know, this is the first event of a two-part series exploring African-American history in Princeton, co-sponsored by the Princeton Public Library, the Historical Society of Princeton, and the Witherspoon Jackson Historical and Cultural Society. You can register for our follow-up discussion program, which is focused on archival material in the Historical Society of Princeton's collection, at the link we will share in the chat. And there are still spaces remaining for the October 7th session. And now to introduce Shirley. Shirley Satterfield is a sixth-generation Princetonian and historian of Princeton's African-American community. She is a highly involved leader throughout Princeton as the president of the Witherspoon Jackson Historical and Cultural Society, a member of the Princeton Historic Preservation Commission, a board member at Not in Our Town, Princeton, and an advisory trustee to us at the Historical Society of Princeton. Ms. Satterfield was instrumental in the establishment of the Witherspoon Jackson Historic District as Princeton's 20th designated historic district. She created the Albert E. Heinz Memorial Walking Tour to increase awareness of Princeton's African-American history. And to commemorate Hines, her friend and fellow history enthusiast, Heinz Plaza in front of the Princeton Public Library is named for him, which is also thanks to Ms. Satterfield's advocacy. Ms. Satterfield personally experienced with the history that she tells. She attended the Witherspoon School for Colored Children when segregation still existed in Princeton, and later transferred to the Nassau Street School in 1947 when integration began. She graduated from Princeton High School and Bennett College, and later earned a master's degree in guidance and counseling at Trenton State College, now the College of New Jersey. She taught elementary and high school and served as a guidance counselor at her alma mater, Princeton High School. Her latest project is developing and installing the heritage plaques in the Witherspoon Jackson Historic District, on which she will be speaking this evening. So now I will pass it off to Shirley.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Izzy. And I also want to thank Kim, who is working these Zooms for me. Well, it's not a Zoom, but she's going to be doing my PowerPoint. I welcome all of you. I'm looking at some of the chats that you have, and I thank you all for welcoming me. We're going to take a tour today. This evening, we're going to focus on understanding Princeton's African-American history through a tour of places and establishments that represent many locations that were established and sustained by the African-American community and were our strongholds during the times of Jim Crow, segregation, and racism in Princeton. We will travel through the streets of Princeton and stop at the noted places that will give the rich history of a proud community. Each one of these plaques has been generously and willingly donated and honored by people in Princeton and organizations. The trustees of the Witherspoon Jackson Historical and Cultural Society sincerely thank each one for their investment in recognizing and respecting this Princeton history. So sit back, get what you have to drink, enjoy, and we're going on a journey.
I'm just getting it. Sorry.
We'll be on a journey.
Let me take your camera off. Okay.
The African American community has been a vital presence in Princeton since the late 17th century. Many residents were slaves who worked on large farms and in homes as domestic and agricultural servants. By the 1700s, there were free colored residents who were descendants of slaves, and in later years, many had migrated from the South to find employment. The increasing wealth in the community, together with the university's growth, created a high demand for labor and service positions that were generously offered to the colored residents. You will hear me use colored Negro because that's who we were at this time. So you're looking at the first slide. This is Albert Heinz Plaza. Albert Heinz Plaza is located next to the Princeton Public Library in honor of Mr. Albert Edward Heinz, the grandson of a slave. He was born and educated in Princeton during the time when the town was segregated. From shining shoes in Princeton University professors, serving on committee boards, a lifetime community leader, teaching bridge at the Princeton Senior Resource Center, Mr. Hines gave loyal service to the Princeton community. The designs on the open gates of the plaza represent the many aspects of his life and service. Mr. Hines was an ordinary man who gave extraordinary service during his 104 years. This plaque is donated by Princeton University. The Imperial Restaurant on the corner of Witherspoon and Halfish Streets. Mr. Burnett Briggs was an African American who came to Princeton from Farmville, Virginia in 1919. He worked as a horseman at the campus club at Princeton University. Mr. Edward I. Hall, president of the Princeton Bank and Trust Company, saw Mr. Briggs as a good man who saved his money, therefore giving Mr. Briggs the opportunity to buy the property on the corner of Witherspoon and Halfish, where he started his Imperial Restaurant on August 1st, 1920. Mr. Briggs was asked to close his restaurant during one of Princeton Borough's urban renewal projects. He fought to keep his establishment, and for 42 years, he served delicious meals to the Princeton community and university students. I remember going to his restaurant when I was little, and one time I got a big ice cream cone, and it cost 5 cents. I was so proud of that ice cream cone. I went out and I showed all my friends the ice cream cone. Unfortunately, there was so much ice cream on the cone that the ice cream fell on the ground. This area is now known as Briggs Corner. The restaurant was featured in the 1940 edition of the Negro Motorist Green Book. This is a picture of Mr. Briggs, and he loved fishing. So this is a picture of one of the fish that he caught, and that's his restaurant at the bottom. And that was on the corner of Halfish and Witherspoon. It's now called Briggs Corner, but if you see the little sign as you go into that parking lot, they changed it to Briggs Lot. There will be a building that will be built on that property, and on the corner of the building will be this plaque. The plaque was donated by Miss Kim Peterson and Miss Wendy Peterson Osborne in memory of their grandfather, Mr. Burnett Briggs. This is Jackson Street. Now you're going to have to look carefully at this. You see a big parking lot. That parking lot was for the cars that went to the Playhouse Theater. The Playhouse Theater was where Mediterra is now. and the back of it faced Jackson Street. So that street that you see at the top is Jackson Street. And a lot of people say, well, this is the Witherspoon Jackson community. What happened to Jackson Street? This location is partially at the location that was Jackson Street, a street that was designated in the 1830s at the beginning of the African community. It was named Jackson Street, unfortunately, after Andrew Jackson. The homes were demolished in 1957 to develop a thoroughfare from Wigan Street to Bayard Lane, Route 206. It couldn't happen because when you got to the end of Witherspoon Street, there was John Street, and there was a big gate along the separated our community from what is called Greenholme. So in the 70s, they decided to make a thoroughfare. So this was the second urban renewal where they displaced our families and made Paul Robeson Place. Now, before it was Paul Robeson Place, it was called Avalon Place to honor the adjoining owned property of professor and Presbyterian minister, Reverend Henry Van Dyke. In 1976, the street was renamed Paul Robeson Place in honor of Paul Leroy Robeson. Paul Robeson Place designates the beginning of the Witherspoon Jackson neighborhood, Princeton's 20th Historic District. This plaque is donated by Mrs. Ingrid W. Reed and Mr. Marvin R. Reed, Mayor of Princeton Borough, 1990 to 2003, in honor of Miss Mildred Trotman, first African-American mayor of Princeton Borough. This is the First Baptist Church of Princeton. Now, when you see the four churches, you're going to see the first structure of the church. This is on the corner of John Street and Paul Robeson Place. When they made the thoroughfare that went through, that is now Paul Robeson Place, they wanted to remove the church because the church was in the way. And at that time, the minister was Reverend Parker, and he said, no way are you going to move our church. So the present church that you see now is the third structure of the church, and it was reconfigured on the land that they had in order to make Paul Robeson Place. The congregation met at a meeting house before they met in this church. The meeting house was on Green Street. Then they met on a home in Witherspoon Street. Then at the Oddfellows Hall, which was on Witherspoon Street. The first church structure was built on John Street, and the cornerstone was laid in 1885. It was called the Bright Hope Baptist Church. In 1930, the church's name was changed to the First Baptist Church. This plaque is dedicated by John and Florence Broadway, Lance Liverman, Floyd Fox, and their families. This is the Dorothea's house that's located on John Street, right across the street from the Baptist Church, 120 John Street. Reverend Henry Van Dyke moved to this area with his family from Germantown, Pennsylvania. He had land that he called Avalon. He was a Presbyterian minister, a professor of literature at Princeton University, a poet, and he also wrote, now when I do a tour, I usually sing this song, so listen to me trying to hum it. Da 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 da. Okay, I can't hear you all, but some of you know that's Ode to Joy. Well, if you go to church where you sing, joyful, joyful, we adore thee, that was written by Reverend Henry Van Dyke, and he wrote many poems and many songs. He was a professor of literature at Princeton University, and he lived at Avalon, and Avalon is the area which is now the playground and the parking lot for the YMCA. That was his, and that's why it was called Avalon, when they made the thoroughfare that went to Wigan Street, because part of it was on his land before they changed it to Paul Robeson Place. He came with his family, and at that time there were many Italian immigrants who came, Many were stonecutters for the university. These families lived in the Witherspoon Jackson community, so they were our neighbors. Reverend Van Dyke's daughter took care of many of them to see that they had their homes, they had education, they had their religious services. And when she was 21, she married a man whose name was Guy McCann. He was a stockbroker from New York. In childbirth, she and her baby died. And to honor her, her father and her husband built the Dorothea's house. It was built in 1913, and they occupied it in 1914. Dorothea's house continues to honor the Italian history and contributions and services, and is welcoming to human rights organizations. A Dorothea's House Scholarship is awarded to qualified students who are at Princeton University and also Princeton University freshman students, or Princeton High School, I should have said. This plaque is donated by the trustees of the Dorothea's House. Mr. Ball's Candy Store, 125 John Street. Mr. Ball came to Princeton in 1922 from Washington, D.C. He moved into this house with his wife, Maria, who came to Princeton from Westmoreland County, Virginia. He started a small store on the side of his house and began serving ice cream in 1929. Many children remember going to Mr. Ball's for all kinds of candy and pickles and snacks and delicious ice cream cones. He had his store until the early 1970s. Mrs. Ball, who the little lady you see at the bottom by his store, she was married. She became Mrs. Hoagland, and for years she was a nurse at Princeton High School. Now, I remember going to Mr. Ball's and getting candy and getting ice cream. And children who went to the Baptist church on Sundays, they had to pass Mr. Ball's store in order to get to the Baptist church. Well, the money that they had for Sunday school never got to Sunday school because they used it to buy candy at Mr. Ball's. So I really remember Mr. Ball and his little candy store. And you'll notice that I'll talk about a lot of places that were candy stores or ice cream parlors, because every other house in our community was a store. We weren't welcomed at stores on Nassau Street. So it was a community that was self-contained and everything was in our community. Now, before Mr. Ball's family moved into this house, it was a home that was owned by the Austin family. Mr. Henry Austin was a Negro editor of a colored newspaper in Princeton called The Citizen. His son, Dr. Henry J. Austin, was a physician who was not welcome to practice in Princeton. So he went to Trenton and he practiced in Trenton. And there are 4 Henry J. Austin health centers in Trenton, and they're named after Dr. Austin, who could not practice here in Princeton. This plaque is donated by Corinne O'Hara and Joel Schwartz and daughters Sarah and Rachel Schwartz in honor of the Witherspoon Jackson community. We're going around the corner to Quarry Street. This is a second structure of the Witherspoon School for Colored Children. It was built in 1907 to accommodate the increasing enrollment of students who attended the first school on the corner of Witherspoon and McLean Streets. The school went through 3 renovations. This is the first renovation of the school. And in 1939, an extension for a gymnasium auditorium was built and a cornerstone was placed. The school educated students from grades kindergarten through 8th grade who lived in Princeton, and the borough the township actually paid the borough to have their children come to Witherspoon rather than to have them go to the white school in the township. In 1948, the schools in Princeton Borough were integrated. This mandate was called the Princeton Plan. The Witherspoon School for Colored Children became the junior high school for all students in the Princeton Borough. In the late 1960s, this building served as a Princeton nursing home. And in 2020, Mr. J. Robert Hillier, architect and developer, converted this original school building into an apartment complex called the Waxwood. And it was named the Waxwood after our principal, Howard B. Waxwood. He was the first African-American principal. This plaque is donated by Reverend David McAlpin, Jr. Mr. Mack. Many of you know Mr. Jimmy Mack. This was his barbershop. Before he had the barbershop here, he worked on his uncle's barbershop on Witherspoon Street that was called Mack's Sanitary Barbershop. He started this barbershop in the early 1960s, and this was a highlight of my tour because when I take people on the tour and stop by his little shop, I said, Mr. Mack, got to come out and talk about your barbershop. And he'd tell people what it was. It was a residence. It was a grocery store. It was a takeout restaurant. It was a speakeasy. And you have to explain to young people what a speakeasy was. And there are people who lived behind Mr. Mack's barbershop. Now, Mr. Mack had this barbershop until about 2014. He started in 1962. And some of the students from the university would come down and get their hair cut because it wasn't that expensive to get their hair cut. And he had quite a lot of people coming because of the tour. Mr. Mack is still here. He goes to Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. And he had a sign at the top of his shop. And I said, Mr. Mack, what are you going to do with that sign? And he said, oh, I guess I'll throw it away. Well, he didn't. I loaned it to the Historical Society. And he was sitting in the chair the last day of his, he was in his shop. And I said, Mr. Mack, what are you going to do with that bench? And he said, oh, I guess I'll throw it away. Well, it's in my dining room. So, you know, you have to save the things that people had because they're really precious. And he had the last African-American business in Princeton. The plaque is donated by Mrs. James and Mr. Audrey Mack, Mr. Thomas and Miss Joanne Parker, and Miss Carol Sinkler. This is the Masonic Temple. The Masonic Temple is on the corner of McLean Street and John Street. Between 1900 and 1907, several Princeton men received their Masonic degrees in craft masonry at King David Lodge number 15, located in Trenton, New Jersey. They then formed a club in Princeton intending to establish their own lodge of free and accepted Masons. On Saturday, April 19th, 1913, Aaron Lodge number 9, F and AM, was duly organized. In May, Aaron Lodge, now 9F and AM Incorporated, purchased this building. Each brother gave $25 toward a loan of $7,500. Aaron Lodge was the first to be incorporated in the state of New Jersey under the F and AM label. This building is now an apartment dwelling, and the plaque was donated by members of the Aaron Lodge number 9 F and AM and Reverend Gregory Smith. Now, can you go back a minute? I'm sorry. Thank you. The names that you see are all the names of the men who started this lodge, and then the pictures. Now, some people who are from Princeton will know that you have some relatives that are in this picture, but we can't quite identify them now, but you'll see them when the plaque is up. Okay, we're going across the street, across John Street. And this is the Charcoal Inn, 184 John Street. It was owned by Mr. William Teague and Mr. William Green. And in the 1930s to the 1940s, it was a social club for colored men. The club was named by the members, and it was invitation only. In the 1939 edition of the Negro Motor Screen Book, it reads, the inn's listed appearance as the famous Charcoal Nemderlarkic Club, dining room, Cocktail Club, telephone 1510-184 John Street, Princeton, New Jersey. Now they named their club Nemderlock. I think that's how you pronounce it. Mr. Hines was trying to get me to say it right. But the club is colored men spelled backward. This plaque is donated by Professor Daniel A. Harris in memory of his great-great-grandfather, Rabbi David Einhorn, Reformed abolitionist in Baltimore, 1855 to 1861. This was called the John Street Wading Pool. It's now Mary Moss Playground, located on John Street, John Street between Witherspoon, between John and Lytle. The John Street Wading Pool was provided in 1946 for the colored children who were not welcomed in other playgrounds in Princeton. Mrs. Moss was a beloved teacher and nurse at the Princeton Nursery School. The children called her Mommy. On June 28, 1954, after retiring from the nursery school, Mrs. Moss became a veteran staff member and supervised this playground. It is now a little sprinkler. The playground little pool is gone, and many children are going there. We're going to have something to represent Mrs. Moss in that playground. This plaque is donated by This plaque is donated by Wilbur Hines, Mr. Marty Hines, Miss Bernadine Hines, in honor of their mother, Frankie M. Hines, who was a playground wading pool lifeguard. Now we're moving to Lytle Street. This is a Charles Robeson American Legion Post number 218. In the early 1900s, this building was a meeting place for the Negro Men's Club known as the Elite Social Club. In 1966, the building was purchased by the Colored American Legion and was named in honor of Charles A. Robinson, a World War I soldier who was the first African-American Princetonian to lose his life in the armed services. The veterans met on the second and fourth Tuesdays of each month to discuss and plan services, events, and community activities, and assisted related to them. They served men who served in the wars. Many of the members formed their own drum and bugle corps that annually performed in the Princeton's Memorial Day Parade. There was also a post number 218 baseball team, and most of the sports teams, there were many in the Princeton Witherspoon Jackson community. This plaque is donated by Louise C. and Clifford Wilson. Now we go to Clay Street. This is when it was called Old Clay Street. And I lived on Old Clay Street. And I lived in a house that was right across the street from that building that you see there, which is an ice plant. And this is how the ice plant looked right before they demolished Clay Street to make the Hegeman houses that are there now. This street was referred to as Old Clay Street until the houses were demolished in 1952. This location was also the property of Mr. Addison Gordon, who had a little park known as the Gordon Park. It's now the parking lot for Clay Street today. Mr. Lonnie Barkley and Mr. Teague owned an ice and wood plant in this area during the early 1940s to 1952. They provided ice for restaurants and establishments in Princeton and delivered blocks of ice to homes that had ice boxes and wood for wood burning stoves and fireplaces. The ice plant was one of many businesses in this community that served several establishments in Princeton. Now, sometimes adults tell you things that really scare you and they don't know that they're scaring you, but somebody told me that the devil lived in the ice plant. And the only way we got out of Clay Street was either to go through the little pathway of two houses or to go around the ice plant, and there was an alleyway that you could go through to go to Witherspoon Street. But I was scared to go through that alleyway because I thought the devil was in the ice plant. So you had to be careful what you tell little kids. But I remember that ice plant, and in the summer it was really great because we could go get little pieces of ice to keep us cool. This ice plant is donated by Mr. Leighton Newland and Miss Jacqueline Swain in honor of their uncle, Lonnie Barkley. We're moving to Lee Avenue. This is 21 Lee Avenue. In the 1930s to the early 1940s, this building was a grocery store owned by Mr. Irving Farrar. He sold it to Frederick and Doris Burrell, who purchased it in 1943. Doris started Doris Burrell's beauty salon, and in later years, she added a fashion boutique. She was also a yoga instructor and provided nutrition information for Princeton residents. On the other side was Fred's florist shop. He supplied flowers and plants for community events. He also owned a taxi service. In 2017, Doris and Fred's granddaughter, Najwa Abdul Kamu, opened her makeover studio. Now, that awning that you see over the door did say Doris Burrell's Salon. And then when Najwa took over, it said Makeover Studio. So it's now a one-family home. And as I do save everything, they took the awning down, and the awning is in my garage. So that's the legacy. And there will be a plaque in front of the house. And the plaque is donated by Cecilia B. Hodges, PhD, in memory of Mr. George and Mrs. Olive James Hodges. This is one picture, or actually two pictures, of the diverse stores on Lee Avenue. All of you know where a local Greek is, and across the street is a Mexican restaurant. Well, the one you see across the street was Balvino's grocery store. And on the other side, where you see the top picture with two gentlemen standing in front, that was on the corner where local Greek is today. And that was Baldino's grocery store. And next to Baldino's grocery store was Billy the Greek. And Billy the Greek had a restaurant. Now you notice that these are all, the Balvinos and Baldinos were Italian. We call them Billy the Greek, but when you're little, you really don't know what, you think that's his name, Billy the Greek. But he served the best hot sausage sandwiches. And during the 1940s to 1960s, this area of the avenue had stores that serviced diverse owners: Italian, Negro, Greek, and Jewish. On the other side of the street, where you see that beautiful mural and a store, that was Miss Rhodes. Miss Rhodes was a Negro woman who had a candy store. And next to her was the Jew lady. Now, we called her the Jew lady because she was Jewish. We can't do that today. But, if my grandmother told me to go and get candy for the children who came to our house for Christian Endeavor on Sundays, she would say, go to the Jew ladies and get candy. So I would get the mint leaves and the orange slices and ate half of them before I got around the corner to Clay Street. But that's what we called her. I don't even remember what her real name was. So this plaque is dedicated by Mr. Kevin and Mrs. Patricia McCarthy in honor of Jean Harrington. This is the Princeton Nursery School on 78 Lee Avenue. It was founded by Mrs. Margaret Matthews in 1929 for the Negro children whose parents worked during the day. Most worked as domestics and laborers. The nursery school provided quality preschool education programs and childcare, modeled after the Montessori philosophy of learning. Mrs. Moss, a longtime Negro Princeton resident, was a teacher and nurse at the nursery school. And in later years, Mrs. Jean Douglas Riley served as teacher and director. Today, the nursery school serves children from diverse backgrounds. This plaque is donated by Not in Our Town, Princeton. We're moving down to Birch Avenue. For those of you who know where Race Street is, if you were to leave the nursery school on the avenue, go down Race Street, you're on the corner of Race and Birch Avenue. That's where these houses started that you see at the bottom. The one that you see at the bottom is next to the first one that you can't see. But all of those houses from Race Street on Birch Avenue all the way down to almost 206. The house that was next to 206 wasn't one of the houses. But these were the houses that were moved from Baker Street. We had our families who lived on Baker Street. That's the picture that you see at the top. And they lived across the street from the university. And many of our relatives worked at the university. Mr. Palmer, who went to Princeton University, Edgar Palmer, when he graduated in 1929, he looked across the street and he said, this looks like an area I could make to look like Rockefeller Center. So in 1929, because of the Depression, he wasn't able to start it. But he came back in the 1930s, like late 1930s, and this was called Baker Alley or Baker Street. And he removed the houses, and as Mr. Hines told me, they put the houses on logs and rolled them down to Birch Avenue. So the house that you see at the bottom is one of the houses that came from Palmer Square. Well, it's now Palmer Square. But Baker Street, that was our first urban renewal when they removed the houses and moved us further down to what is called the Witherspoon Jackson community. Now, when I lived on Clay Street with my mother and my grandmother, when they demolished the houses on Clay Street to make the Hegeman houses that are there now, my mother and my grandmother and I moved in that house that you see on the far right-hand side. And we lived there until they made the Hegeman houses, and then we moved back to Clay Street. This plaque is donated by Stephanie Charney, dedicated to the generation of neighbors who came before us. We're still on Birch Avenue. This is the Elks home, Lodge 178, that really started where the Masonic Temple was. But they moved down to this small building at 124 Birch Avenue. This was one of 3 fraternal organizations. In 1937, the Elks, a fraternal organization, moved from the Masonic Temple to this location on Birch Avenue. The building was purchased by the Elks in 1948 and continued to be a social establishment for club meetings, fraternal events, and neighborhood gatherings. This plaque is donated by Mr. Kevin and Mrs. Patricia McCarthy. Moving down to Birch Avenue, this is 43.5 Birch Avenue. Now, the 4 churches that you see the original church. And as I said, most of the churches started in homes. And this building was their little prayer building before they built the building that's next to it. And it's still there, and the plaque is in front of that building. Elder Daniel Gulp Thomas founded this church in 1923 and was originally named Church of God in Christ. The first service of the local congregation were held in the small house owned by the elder of the church, then moved to a small building next to the church. The church was chartered on the 25th Sunday in June 1941 and was renamed Morning Star Church of God in Christ. It's a Pentecostal church. The present church building was constructed in 1952. This plaque is donated by Mamie Lee Oldham, Eric and Minnie Craig, and their families. We're moving up Witherspoon Street. Now, when I do the tour and I leave Birch Avenue and I start going up Witherspoon Street, by that time people are really tired. And they said, oh, this is really a hill. And I said, that's why we called it going uptown. When we went up to Nassau Street, we never called it downtown. It was always going uptown. So if you hear anybody saying I'm going uptown, you know that they are at least 50 or older. But that was going uptown. So we're going up Witherspoon Street, and we're stopping on the corner of McLean Street and Witherspoon. In 1851, the state of New Jersey authorized the incorporation of public schools in Princeton Borough. To accommodate the educational needs of the colored children, this building was constructed in 1873. It was called the Witherspoon School for Colored Children, educating children from kindergarten through 8th grade. Paul Leroy Robeson attended the primary grades. In 1908, a new and larger school was built on Quarry Street, which we have seen before. This first school building became Douglas Hall, named after Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist, a multi-use building for neighborhood religious services, social gatherings, and later years this structure became an apartment building. Mr. J. Robert Hillier, architect and developer, will restore this building, and it will look as it did when it was a school, as you see at the top. Now at the bottom, you see the children, and they're from grades kindergarten through 8th grade. And that original picture is in my family. It's kind of like in pieces now, but I was able to restore it. And on the back of it, it says, Witherspoon School, 1904. Somewhere in this picture is Paul Robeson. Now, there's not a person alive who can identify where Paul Robeson is, but he's somewhere in that picture. This plaque is dedicated by Mr. J. Robert and Miss Barbara Hillier in honor of Shirley Satterfield. And the reason that I think it is in my honor is because my grandma taught Paul Robeson in that school. She taught him in 1904, 1905. This is the entrance right across the street from the school, the entrance to the colored cemetery. Now, this isn't the first entrance, but this was the most convenient entrance. The first entrance was on a little street further up on the next block called Shirley Court. So the Princeton Cemetery was established in 1757. It's owned by Nassau Presbyterian Church. The land became became the stewards of the cemetery. The oldest section of the cemetery is located at the intersection of Witherspoon and Wigan Street, where early College of New Jersey, Princeton University presidents are buried. In 1807, the colored section of the cemetery was established. This is the location of the separate entrance. Noted African Americans are buried in this section: slaves, servants, laborers, veterans, clergy, educators, musicians, government officials, and entrepreneurs. This plaque is donated by Rosetta Bruce in honor of her husband, and Miss Rashima and Certain, I don't think I pronounced his name right, Sunder Shara, MD. Sorry, Sunder. Now we're going back across the street, right across the street from the school. This is Mount Pisgah African Methodist Episcopal, AME Church, 170 Witherspoon Street. It's the oldest of the 4 African-American churches. It was organized in 1832 by Sampson Peters, a minister from Trenton. The congregation met in the house across the street until they went in this building in 1835, when the church structure was built. You see in front all of the congregation and some of the men who worked. This was the first church. A small cemetery was in the rear of the church, and I assume the cemetery was there before they had the cemetery across the street. This plaque is dedicated by Jacqueline Gary, Leighton Newland, Myrna Anderson Fuller, in honor of their families. Okay, we're moving up Witherspoon Street, and you'll look across the street, that little boy there, if anybody knows Joan Hill, that's Joan Hill's brother. Across the street, you see a building that is now a Latino grocery store. It was Miss Pearl Allen Moore's Tavern. This location was the site of Miss Pearl Allen Moore's Tavern. It was a meeting place for the neighborhood residents to meet for social drinking parties and playing pool. During the summer months, migrant workers who served on the farms in Hightstown would come on the weekends in trucks to have a place for entertainment and light dancing and social gathering. There were noted musicians in Princeton and neighboring states who would come here to entertain at the tavern. This plaque is donated by the Princeton Community Housing. On the corner of Witherspoon Street and Quarry Street is a Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. In 1766, the first church building for the First Presbyterian Church, Nassau Presbyterian Church, was then First Presbyterian Church. They had 3 fires. In the second fire, the parishioners worshiped at the Theological Seminary. And the 90 of the 126 parishioners who were slaves who worshiped in the gallery came down Witherspoon Street and started a church of their own. Now, they probably started, we think that maybe some of them worshiped in the house that is now the Paul Robeson house, because the church was not built until 1840. On March 10, 1838, 90 of the 131 colored members of the First Presbyterian Church were dismissed to start a church of their own. It was called the First Presbyterian Church of Color. The sacrament of Holy Communion was given on the second Sabbath of October, 1840. So next month, we will celebrate 180 years. This date marked the official beginning of the church. In 1848, the church name was changed from the First Presbyterian Church of Color in Princeton to Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. Reverend William Drew Robeson, father of Paul Robeson, was our minister from 1879 until 1901. This plaque is donated by Earl Buggs, Shirley Satterfield, and Mildred Trotman and families. There's going to be a community conversation on Sunday given by the Civil Rights Commission in Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. And I hope you all tune in, because after we talk, we're going to meet at the Paul Robeson House and march to the seminary to commemorate the upheaval that happened at Paul Robeson House and happened at the seminary. And you'll hear all about it by our Reverend Lukata Mjumbe on Sunday. This is the Paul Robeson House. It was a double house at that time. You see Witherspoon Street, and you see the trolley tracks. There was a trolley that went from Princeton to Trenton. On the right-hand side, you can't really see it, but it's a wooden fence. And I know that this picture was taken before 1916 because the wooden fence was gone and it became an iron fence. That's where the cemetery is. If you look on the left-hand side, you will see a white staircase. That's the Paul Robeson House on the corner of Green and Witherspoon Streets. It was a double house, 70 and 71. This house is the birthplace of Paul Leroy Bustle Robeson, scholar, athlete, lawyer, activist, singer, actor. He was born in this house on April 9th, 1898. When his family moved into this house, his father was a Presbyterian minister, and this location was a double house, as I said before. The house is now the property of Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. The mission of the house is to be a beacon in the African American community, to serve as a cultural center in Princeton, and memorabilia of the life and achievements of Paul Leroy Robeson, Princeton's native son. Now, after the Robesons moved in 1901, they moved around on Green Street, which we'll see in a moment. But I want you to look at the house. And you see a little circle that's in the front of the house. That was a little stone circle that was removed. But in back of that circle is a door. And that door led down to what was then, when it became a rooming house, it became Mr. Graham's barbershop. So his barbershop was in that area. And also there were men who worked on the avenue. Now we called it the avenue. That's where our families worked on Prospect for the eating clubs at the university. And one of the professors was able to send men in that little section, and that's where they had time to relax, to have a little drink, to play cards. But that was their little resting place after they came from working on the avenue. And then it became Mr. Graham's barbershop. It is now, for those of you who have passed it, you will see that the whole side on Green Street now is being redone, and it's going to become a cultural center for Princeton, and in respect for our community, Witherspoon Jackson community. That picture that you see at the top is a young Paul Robeson. This plaque is donated by Reverend David and Mrs. Karen Miller. Now we go right around the corner on Green Street. There's a little house on Green Street, but we decided not to put the little house on the plaque because it really isn't a good representation of the house, because so much has been added to it. So we have a picture of Reverend Robeson and a picture of his wife, Maria Louisa Bustle Robeson. In 1901, Reverend William Drew Robeson moved his family to this house when he was dismissed as a minister from Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. Reverend Robeson continued to serve this community, and he worked as an ashman to support his family. Another word for an ashman is a garbage man. After Paul's mother suffered, she was tending to the coal stove, and one of the embers caught hold of her garment, and she burned severely, and she suffered, and she also went blind. She was a teacher in the community also. And when she died, Reverend Robeson wanted her to be buried in proximity to the house. So if you were to leave the Robeson house on Witherspoon Street and go across the street and go through the cemetery gates, you go straight through to their tombstone. Now, some people say, well, how could she be buried there? Because that's, quote, the white section of the cemetery. And the reason is because the cemetery is owned by the Presbyterian Church. Reverend Robeson, being Presbyterian, was given permission to bury his wife in that section of the cemetery. And when he passed, he's also buried there. So if you go directly down the path of the opening of the cemetery, you go right to their tombstone. Now, Paul lived with his father in this house until 1907. And his father moved to Westfield to look for a place to live. And Paul stayed in the house because he was taken care of by his relatives who were in Princeton, and all of the community took care of little Paul. So when his father was established in Westfield, he sent for Paul. Paul didn't like Westfield because it wasn't as homey as Princeton, even though he didn't like Princeton because it was segregated, but it was home to him because his family and the whole community were here. But his father moved to Westfield and he became a Methodist minister. And then he moved to Somerville, where Paul went to high school. This plaque is donated by Miss Deborah Hobler and family in loving memory of Herbert W. Hobler and Mary R. Hobler. And you remember Mr. Hobler, he used to have the radio station WHWH. This is the Witherspoon, or the colored YMYWCA. This picture that you see is shared also with the Princeton Historical Society. This building is on the corner of John, actually it's also part on the corner of Paul Robeson Place, but this was the Colored Y. The Colored Y became a branch of the National YMCA in 1917, and after meeting in several locations, the Y moved to 102 Witherspoon Street. After a fire in the first building, this second building was built in 1938. In addition to the 4 churches, the Y was the focal point of the Black community. Now you see the men here, they're standing with a chart that shows how much money was collected so that they could repair the Y. In 1950, when the YMYW was integrated, in 1958, and moved to Paul Robeson Place, it's now a building for the Arts Council of Princeton, the Paul Robeson Center for the Arts. When the new building was built where the YMYWCA is now in 1958, the new director was Mrs. Susie Waxwood, who was the wife of Mr. Waxwood, and she was the executive director of the new Y from 1958 to 1968. The plaque is donated by the Princeton Family YMCA. This building is on Spring Street. When you turn the corner onto Spring Street, it's that double building on the left-hand side. This building was owned by Mr. William, they called him Sport, Mr. William Moore. He moved from North Carolina to Princeton and bought this property at 4 and 6 Spring Street. He was a successful owner of an antique store on 4 Spring Street and a used clothing store at 6 Spring Street. They say that in his antique furniture store, he gave the antique desk to Woodrow Wilson, and it was in his office at Princeton University. And his clothing store, they say that many of the students from Princeton University would come and sell their suits so they would have money to go into New York. Now you can see Mr. Moore, he's the one who's kind of leaning, he's in the middle and he's leaning toward the gentleman on his left-hand side. And in the back, you can see it says clothing, but that was his clothing store. And that's where his, when he sold the building, the store where you see the 2 ladies, that was his daughter. And her name was Christine Moore. She married a Mr. Howell, who was a doctor. So Christine Moore Howell had this vanity beauty parlor. She was born in 1899, and during the 1920s to 1950s, she was a proprietor of Christine's Vanity Parlor. And in the rear of her salon, she had a chemistry lab where she made her products, her hair and skin products. She was the first colored person to be appointed to the Board of Beauty Culture Control. So that's she standing with probably one of her workers. Now I remember one, and she served, they call her high-class women. She served mostly white women in Princeton. And when I was younger, my mother sent me to her to get my hair washed, and she washed my hair in the back in her chemistry lab, because at that time, because it was a segregated Princeton, she was concerned about if any white woman had come in to see her working on colored hair. On the other side, in later years, was Rex Gorley's art studio, and you can see Mr. Gorley at the top. Mr. Gorley was born in 1903 and was commissioned by the Princeton Art Group to come from Chicago. He studied in Berlin and in Paris and in London. He was the first artist in Princeton to introduce and present an outdoor exhibit in Palmer Square. In 1955, he moved his studio to the Canal. He lived on Canal Road off of Alexander, and he had his studio there. Many people who live in Princeton remember having taken some of his courses. There's a painting of his that's in the Arts Council that he did of migrant workers from Hikestown. And there's a big one that's in the entrance at the Historical Society that actually was in the Robeson house when Mrs. Taylor lived there. So these are the 2 buildings that Mr. Moore owned. And there's a little plaque that's dedicated to his wife, to his daughter, that was put there by Mr. Moore, who lived on Clearview Road. Okay, this is dedicated by, I don't really know who the dedication is. Oh, it's dedicated by Mark Frieda. Thank you, Mark Frieda. Okay, this is the last one. We're going up Witherspoon Street toward Nassau. And this is where LaHare's restaurant used to be. And before it was LaHare's restaurant, it was a newspaper publishing company called The Citizen. And the newspaper was dedicated to the moral, intellectual, and industrial improvement of the Negro race. It was owned by what they called the Negro editor, Mr. Henry J. Austin. And you remember I mentioned where he lived on John Street. It was published every Friday at 9 Witherspoon Street. It cost 5 cents a copy. Before it was a publishing company, it was a grocery store owned by Mr. DePure. This plaque is donated by Kip Cherry, Letitia Fraga, and John Heilner. And folks, I thank you. This is your tour. I want to thank Robert Hillier, who made these plaques possible. We're still working on them. They're in the factory and they would have been done, but because of the pandemic, we have to take some time. I want to also thank one of his architects, Julian Edgarin, who helped us write the plaques and help us get the plaques together. I hope you all enjoyed this. When it's warm and we can go out, we'll take a tour, but I hope you enjoyed this tour going through. There are many, many other places, and some people said, well, why don't you do so-and-so's grocery store or so-and-so's ice cream parlor? But we would have plaques all over Princeton. So we did our best to give you some of the 29 plaques. And I thank you very much. And if there are any questions, let me know.
Shirley, we do have some questions. Thank you so much. It was really wonderful. And I appreciate how you sort of oriented us along the tour as you described each plaque. So the first question we have from Lauren B. Davis is it true that the first school for Black children was in Trinity Church?
The first school for colored children was a little house that was given by the Presbyterian women at the First Presbyterian Church. And that's where Betsy Stockton taught the children. When she came back from Hawaii, she went to Philadelphia to teach, and she went to Canada to teach. And then she came back to Princeton and she taught in that little building. I'm not too sure, I don't even know where the building is on Witherspoon Street. But as far as Trinity Church, I haven't heard of a school. It could have been that they taught some of the children there before the school was built, but I don't have any evidence of that. But if you do, please let me know.
Thank you. Tom Pyle would like to know, where was Dr. Henry J. Austin buried?
I don't know. He's not in Princeton Cemetery. I don't know, but thank you for asking, and I'll find out.
Thank you. We have a question now from Martha Sword. She asks, where did Mr. T get the ice from? Was it Mountain Lakes?
They made the ice in the ice plant. Where he got the water from, I'm not sure. He could have gone to Mountain Lakes, but Mountain Lakes had their own ice plant, but that I'm not sure.
All right, terrific. Michael Timmons says, this is amazing. Can you give more details on the program on Sunday at the Witherspoon Presbyterian Church in March? So I just want to say that I put a link in there that people can follow to the municipal website for the link to the program, but I don't know if you want to talk more about it.
You mean the program I talked about for Sunday?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, it's given by the Civil Rights Commission, and they asked Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church to partner with them, and it's going to be on Zoom, and it's going to be a panel. We have some people on. There's someone from a Hispanic organization that's on. I'll be on. Reverend June Day will be there. Thomas Parker will be there. I don't know who else will, but
I'll
we'll
be there.
give some information about the history first, and then we will assemble at Paul Robeson House, and Benjamin Colbert and I will say something about the Paul Robeson House, and Pastor Njumbe will talk about the conditions and the events that happened at the Paul Robeson House and also happened at the seminary.
And it's
But
correct.
please tune in. Please tune in. Mm-hmm.
It starts at Paul Robeson House, and then everyone will walk to the seminary.
It starts at 7:00 on Zoom first.
Yes.
And then they'll tell you when to assemble at the Paul Robeson House. And if you're interested, please let me know, because we have to have the names of the people who would like to march.
I think the Zoom starts at 6 p.m. and then the march starts at like 7 or 7:15.
Okay.
And
for those who don't want to walk, you can go to the seminary and meet us at the seminary, because there's going to be a short talk when we get to the chapel.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is, I think probably for me. Lauren Davis asks, would love to send this talk to some far-flung librarian friends. Will it be recorded? I'm happy to answer that the talk has been recorded and is being recorded, and it will be available on Crowdcast within 10 minutes after we end the broadcast, and it'll be on the library's YouTube channel, and if you'd like copies of it, please feel free to send it to me. Send me an email. And I think that those are the questions that Ferns has written. It says, what my family, the Reddings, that we asked to, I'm not sure, Revix. Fern, I don't know if you're listening, if you can type the question, if I'm not understanding it properly. And if anyone else has questions, please feel free to type them into the Ask a Question feature. Meanwhile, I might invite Stephanie Schwartz from the Historical Society back up. Stephanie, if that's okay with you, if you'd like to sort of get prepared to wrap up or add anything to what Ms. Satterfield has been sharing. And I'll toggle the video up. You're coming up now. I want to give you a warning that that's what was about to happen.
Great. Not too much to add. Thank you, Shirley, for that tour. That was great.
Fern clarified and said, "What happened to the REDDIM? Redim? Does that make sense to you?"
The Redim. Who's it from?
Fern Spruill.
What happened to the Redding? Oh, her family, the Reddings. I don't know what she means by what happened to them. I know that they're lifelong family in Princeton, and her grandmother, who was, oh gosh, I can't think of her grandma's name, and I should know because Aunt Eva McEwen. And she was Redding. She lived on Green Street, and she was a member of our church. And she was one of the first, she went to art school, and she was one of the first Black artists in this community. But I'm not sure I know what she means by what happened to the Reddings. I know that, I think 5th generation in Princeton, very prominent Princetonians. And Mrs. Redding is her mother.
Thank you. Is that what Redding is? Is Redding Circle named after her family? You know?
I don't know. That's the first time I heard that. I really don't know.
Oh, I don't know. I was just asking.
Tell her if she can add it in the chat. Can she put it in the chat whether or not?
You know what? I can start the chat back up. So if anyone wants to add anything, but overall, I just want to say on behalf of the library, I'm so thrilled, really, that we were able to get through the tech challenges we were having.
Yeah, I was kind of nervous about getting through that. You could tell I was
and that we but just to have you go through each plaque and give us this virtual tour is really such a wonderful, wonderful treasure for us to be able to share, not just with our community, but even more broadly. You've put so much work into this. and so many people in the community have contributed to these plaques. They're a real treasure, and so are you, Shirley.
Yeah. And I thank them all. I really do. Yeah. And, I've been doing this history since 1997 when we had the exhibit of African Americans in Princeton at the Historical Society. I said, well, we can't stop here. And that's when we started the tour. And I had it named after Mr. Hines because Mr. Hines he just did so much in Princeton. He was my history partner. And whenever I had to do presentations, I said, Mr. Hines, we got to go do our dog and pony show. And he would get his cane and get in the car. He drove until he was 104.
My goodness.
Yeah. And when he would drive, he'd go into his driveway. And I said that his car should be in the Smithsonian Institution because his car was, I don't know what happened to the car, but on his obituary, the car is on the last page. And his car had a lot of nicks in it because he would hit the side of his house, and he would take duct tape and he would put duct tape where the nicks were, and then he painted the color of his car. But he was such a dynamic person, and when we wanted to do a tribute to him at the plaza, it was actually Jim Floyd who suggested those open gates to open up what was a segregated Princeton. So when you see those gates and you see those signs, each sign is a symbol of something in his life, and he has there. It's always the right time to do the right thing, which I think comes from Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yes, and for those who may not be familiar, Heinz Plaza, now so named because of Ms. Satterfield's work, is the large open space, the plaza just outside the library on Witherspoon Street.
Somebody said I remember seeing Mr. Hines leaving what is now Walgreens at the shopping center. Took his walker and put it in the trunk of his car, got in and drove away.
That's Linda Oppenheim.
Yeah, he was a great person. Yeah. His grandfather, who was a slave, they say he planted a tree on Princeton University's campus.
Yeah, that's so great.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Well, we're getting a lot of thank yous coming in through the chat. Stephanie, we have 2 more programs that the Historical Society is going to offer. Do you want to tell a little bit about those programs that are coming up?
Yep, we're offering discussion programs that sort of are exploring this history a little further through documents in the Historical Society of Princeton's collection. That's a program that we're currently offering twice on September 30th and October 7th. I believe the September 30th session is full, if not almost full, but as of when we started, there were still spaces for the October 7th. So if you want to explore further, definitely sign up.
All right, terrific. Thank you both so much. Shirley, do you have any closing remarks?
Can I just say that the Witherspoon Jackson Historical and Cultural Society has a new website, and our newsletters are in the website, and also our upcoming event. So if you go, all you have to do is do Princeton and the initials for Witherspoon Jackson Historical and Cultural Society, WJHCS.org. And we would like you to join our newsletter and give a donation or just say hi and read our information. But we have an up and coming fundraiser, and it's going to feature Mr. Taylor Marrow, who was a Princeton resident, who is now a professor in Oregon. And read it. It's going to be quite interesting. It's October the 13th.
Fantastic. And Izzy Kasdan, the executive director of the Historical Society of Princeton, just put in the link to your website in the chat for anybody who wants it. And Lisa Beach says, Mrs. Satterfield, you're an inspiration to all historians. So I think that's a pretty good place to end.
Oh my gosh. Thank you all. Thank you.
Have a wonderful evening.
And you also. And bye, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a blessed